Naomi Bennett sat at her table in the luxury restaurant, with her back straight and impeccable posture. The brilliant chandeliers above her reflected off the polished cutlery, casting a soft, shimmering light over the room. She had frequented high-end establishments before, but tonight she felt the weight of every gaze in the room, lingering over her like the only Black woman dining alone in this sea of privilege. The strategies were not subtle. They didn't need to be. Naomi was not there to enjoy the food or the ambience. She was on duty as an experienced FBI agent. She had spent years blending in, perfecting the art of becoming invisible in any environment, but tonight something felt different. Every nerve in her body buzzed with a restlessness she couldn't shake. She adjusted her bracelet, an elegant piece of technology disguised as a delicate accessory, and scanned the room without moving her head. Her target, Malcolm Vance, had just entered the restaurant, tall, slender, and brimming with charm. He was a well-known businessman with secret ties to criminal syndicates involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and even human trafficking. Tonight was the night she was supposed to gather critical information about him. All her months of undercover work had led her to this moment, and she couldn't afford any distractions. Naomi's calm demeanor showed the urgency of the mission. Her instincts told her something was going to go wrong, and her instincts rarely failed. At that moment, the soft murmur of conversations around the restaurant ceased. Naomi's sharp eyes caught the reason for the sudden shift in atmosphere. Officer Greg Hayward had entered the restaurant. His uniform stood out in the luxurious setting, and his demeanor suggested a man who enjoyed asserting his authority. Naomi knew his type too well. She had dealt with men like him all her life, men who first saw her skin color, who questioned her right to be in spaces like these, who didn't need much reason to assume the worst. Hayward's eyes briefly scanned the room before settling directly on Naomi. A slow, cold realization hit her. He wasn't there for the restaurant's security. He was there for her. Her hand instinctively moved towards her bracelet, her fingers brushing the hidden recording device. The mission was already on the edge, and the last thing she needed was a confrontation with a policeman. Drunk on power, Hayward approached her table with his hand resting lightly on his belt, where his gun and handcuffs hung. The restaurant's diners, now fully engrossed in the unfolding drama, watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Excuse me, miss." Hayward's voice was low but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need to see your ID." Naomi's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. She looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his with practiced indifference. "May I ask what this is about?" she inquired in a serene voice. "You don't belong here," Hayward said with clipped words, effortlessly masking the disdain in his tone. "I've received complaints about you." Naomi felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her race, her presence in this luxury establishment questioned simply for being a Black woman dining alone. She had encountered this kind of profiling before, but never in the midst of such a critical operation. She knew that reacting too much could jeopardize everything, but she wasn't going to let this man humiliate her without reason. Calmly, she reached into her bag and handed over her ID, fully aware of what would come next. Hayward yanked her by the arm, his eyes narrowing as he read her name aloud. "Naomi Bennett," he murmured, "doesn't sound like someone who would dine here alone." Her stomach churned, not out of fear, but from the bitter taste of injustice, yet outwardly she remained serene. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, maintaining her neutral tone. "You're telling me," Hayward replied, tossing her ID back. "What are you really doing here? This place is reserved for people who can afford it." Naomi clenched her jaw, but kept her voice composed. "I'm dining. Is that a crime?" The tension between them crackled, and Naomi noticed Vance looking in her direction. The worst possible outcome was unfolding. She was drawing attention. Her heart pounded as she calculated her next move. If she couldn't defuse this situation quickly, the entire operation would collapse, and Vance would slip through her fingers. "I need you to come with me for an interrogation," Hayward ordered, clearly enjoying the power he wielded at that moment. Naomi's cover was rapidly falling apart, and she was running out of options. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," she tried one last time with a voice loaded with controlled frustration. "I'm just here to dine." but it was already too late. Hayward signaled a second officer who had just arrived, and together they moved to arrest her. Before Naomi could object, she felt the cold metal against her wrists, the handcuffs clicking deliberately shut. The humiliation burned, but worse than the indignity was the fact that her mission, months of work, was unraveling before her eyes. As the officers dragged her brusquely out of the restaurant, Naomi caught one last glance of Vance watching from his seat at the bar, his brow furrowed in confusion. She had lost her cover, but not all was lost yet. As they pushed her towards the back of the patrol car, Naomi's mind raced at full speed. She had to find a way to turn this around, or everything she had worked for would be in vain. The patrol car cruised through the city streets, its lights flashing rhythmically and casting eerie red and blue shadows over Naomi Bennett's face as she sat in the back seat. Her hands remained cuffed behind her, the cold metal digging into her skin, a bitter reminder of her current situation. Officer Greg Hayward was in the driver's seat. His partner, Officer Richards, sat silently beside him. Neither seemed aware of the magnitude of the mistake they were making. Naomi's heart pounded, not out of fear, but from the implications of what had just happened. The mission hung by a thread, and as they drove away from the restaurant, her mind raced with scenarios. She had spent months infiltrating Malcolm Vance's life, the charismatic businessman suspected of running one of the largest money laundering rings on the East Coast. Vance, along with his high-level associates, operated under the guise of legitimate businesses, channeling millions of dirty dollars into luxury restaurants, exclusive nightclubs, and extensive real estate projects. Naomi's presence in the restaurant wasn't a coincidence. It was part of a calculated plan to gather enough evidence to take him down. And now, thanks to Officer Hayward, that plan was in serious jeopardy. She glanced at Hayward in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met briefly, and a small arrogant smile played on his lips. He thought he had control of the situation, that he was making the decisions. The thought almost made her laugh. He had no idea who she was, nor any clues that the woman sitting silently in the back seat was much more than the defenseless black woman he assumed her to be. But Naomi was too disciplined to let her emotions show. She had been in much worse situations before and was not about to lose her composure now. "What's so funny?" Hayward shouted, suddenly noticing the slight curve of her lips. Naomi's expression hardened. "Nothing, officer," she said in a measured tone, showing no emotion. She was just thinking about what he was doing. Turning slightly in her seat to face her, his curiosity increased. "What's a woman like you doing in a place like this anyway? Did you think you could mingle with the city's elite? Deceive them?" The implication behind his words did not go unnoticed by Naomi. In his eyes, a black woman like her didn't belong in a luxury restaurant, mingling with powerful and wealthy individuals. To Hayward, she was an outsider, someone who didn't have the right to be in that world. It was a story she had lived countless times before, a narrative she knew all too well, but this time it was different. This time the stakes were much higher. "I told you, Naomi," she replied with a calm and unwavering voice. "I was dining." Hayward snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Dining, huh? Do you expect me to believe that a woman like you in a place like that without food on your table, just sitting there like you own the place? You're not fooling me." Naomi remained silent, her thoughts turning inward. She knew it was better not to engage with men like Hayward. His assumptions about her were already made, and nothing she said would change his opinion. He had already pigeonholed her into a role she had no interest in playing, but she was not defenseless, not by a long shot. The patrol car began to slow as they approached the police station, its dirty exterior starkly contrasting with the luxurious restaurant where Naomi had been just moments before. When the car stopped, Hayward opened the door, jerking Naomi out of the back seat. She stumbled slightly but steadied herself, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. He led her inside, his hand grabbing her arm a little too tightly, but Naomi did not protest. She was patiently awaiting the right moment to reveal who she truly was. They walked through the hallways with dim fluorescent lighting of the station, filled with sounds of ringing phones, shuffling papers, and the occasional distant shout from a detention cell. Naomi's mind remained focused on her objective. She couldn't lose sight of her mission, not even now. She was deeply undercover, and although this arrest was an unexpected diversion, it wasn't the end. Hayward led her to a small, dimly lit interrogation room and gestured for her to sit. Naomi complied, her wrists cuffed behind her. Hayward walked in front of her, his self-satisfaction radiating from every movement. "So we're going to make this easy, huh?" he began, leaning against the table. "Why don't you tell me what you were really doing in that restaurant?" Naomi looked at him, her face blank. "I've already told you," she replied. Hayward laughed darkly. "I know you think you're smart, but we both know there's more to this than just a dinner." He crossed his arms, studying her. "You don't seem like someone who belongs in a place like that, and don't think I didn't notice how nervous you were when I walked in." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. This was worse than she thought. Not only had Hayward completely misinterpreted the situation, but he was also dangerously close to exposing her mission. If she pushed too hard, too fast, she could jeopardize everything. She needed to handle this carefully. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said calmly. "I wasn't watching anyone." Hayward smiled smugly, clearly enjoying the cat-and-mouse game. "I've seen your type before. You dress elegantly thinking you can blend in with the big players, but you forget that people like me are always watching, always ready to bring you back to reality." Naomi's patience was wearing thin, but she couldn't afford to lose her composure. She glanced around the room, noticing the security cameras in the corners. Every move she made was being recorded, and that could work in her favor or against her, depending on how she handled the situation. As Hayward continued to interrogate her, Naomi made a decision. She would let him dig his own grave. She wasn't the one under real scrutiny here. The truth was that Hayward was operating outside his jurisdiction. He had arrested her without cause, profiled her based on her appearance, and violated countless protocols in the process, and it was all being recorded. Naomi allowed him to rant, his arrogance growing with every word. "You're just another opportunist trying to play a game that's too big for you," he said. "You thought you could deceive people like me, but you're not as smart as you think." Finally, Naomi spoke, her voice cold and measured. "I think you've made a mistake." Hayward smiled even more. "Oh yeah? And what mistake would that be?" Naomi looked at him intently, her calm exterior hiding the storm brewing inside her. "You're going to regret this." Hayward laughed, shaking his head. "Regret? The only one who's going to regret anything tonight is you." Naomi leaned slightly forward, her unwavering gaze. "You have no idea who you've arrested, do you?" Hayward paused, his confidence wavering for the first time. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door to the interrogation room burst open. A tall man in a suit, his face marked by a serious expression, entered the room. Hayward's posture immediately stiffened, his bravado crumbling. The man wasted no time with pleasantries. "Officer Hayward," he said, "release her now." Hayward blinked, clearly taken aback, but the man repeated brusquely, "Hayward." Hayward hesitated for a moment before reaching for his keys and unlocking Naomi's handcuffs. As soon as her wrists were free, the man extended his hand. "Agent Bennett, I apologize for the inconvenience. You may go." Naomi slowly stood, rubbing her sore wrists as she accepted his hand. She turned to Hayward, her eyes cold. "I told you," she said softly, "you made a mistake." Hayward stood there, speechless, his face losing color as the realization of what he had done slowly settled in. Naomi didn't waste another second with him. Without another word, she left the room. Her mind was already preparing for the next phase of her mission. The game was far from over, and more than ever, she was determined to see it through to the end. The revelations and consequences. Naomi sat in her apartment, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with tension, and her pulse pounded constantly in her ears. The plan was underway, but its weight bore down on her like a physical presence. She had spent the last few weeks walking a thin line between Malcolm Vance's trust and the FBI's pressure to take him down. Every conversation with him had been a calculated risk, every word a potential misstep. Now she was too deep to back out. Vance had accepted her into his world, albeit cautiously. He had tested her loyalty in subtle ways, Mild provocations to see if she would flinch, questions about her arrest to gauge her bitterness towards the police. Naomi had played her role to perfection, feeding his ego to allow him to believe she had grown disillusioned with the system. It had worked. Vance now saw her as an ally, someone he could mold into a tool for his own purposes. But what he didn't know was that she had been gathering every fragment of intelligence she could, every piece bringing her closer to the heart of his operation. Tonight was different. Tonight, everything would be resolved. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, shaking her from her thoughts. Naomi grabbed it, reading the message from Jack Monroe. "We're in position, it's your time now. Be careful." Naomi looked at the message for a moment before locking her screen. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, reality hit hard. The office was ready to move, and she was the one who would set the final trap. Her part in this operation was critical. Without her, they wouldn't have enough to take down Vance. The plan was simple. Vance had invited her to a high-risk meeting tonight, one that involved his top associates. Naomi had confirmed through her informant that this meeting would be more than just a simple discussion. It was the moment Vance planned to reveal his next big move, something that would not only secure his criminal empire, but also involve high-profile figures across the country. If she could gather enough evidence at this meeting, the FBI would have everything it needed to take down not just Vance, but his entire network. But the danger was palpable. Vance wasn't stupid. If he suspected her, even for a second, it would all be over. He wouldn't hesitate to kill her. No one ever comes out alive from Malcolm Vance's inner circle. Naomi took a deep breath, stealing a breath. She had faced death before, countless times, but this time the stakes were higher. This time it wasn't just her life at risk, but the lives of every agent involved in the operation, every innocent person caught in Vance's web of crime. She could. If this video has helped you connect more with yourself and inspired you on your journey of growth, take action and subscribe to the Vidas Inspiration channel to discover more stories that will fill you with motivation and hope. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment telling me how this story has impacted your life or what reflections it has left you with. And if you believe this message can inspire someone you know, share it with your friends so they too can find inspiration and purpose in their lives.